So good morning to everyone once again. I'm Mike Albertson. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Thank you as always to those in the audience for tuning in to hear the presentation this morning. We'll hear today from Dr. Hal Brands, who's the Henry A. Kissinger Distinguished Professor at Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C., for a CGSR lecture series talk titled The Twilight Struggle, What the Cold War Teaches Us About Great Power Rivalry Today. And this talk shares the name with Dr. Brands' recently published book, which just came out at the end of January of this year from Yale University Press. And we'll put the link to the book here as Dr. Brands finishes his remarks. This talk fits into a larger series of speakers we've had here at CGSR with the purpose of giving the lab audience a wider perspective on a new era of strategic competition with Russia and China. You can find a lot of these talks on the speaker series page on the CGSR website. But given everything taking place right now in Ukraine and given everything taking place between Russia and China in this context, it's a very timely book and a very timely talk for us to have. As someone who's read a lot of Cold War history, I absolutely love the framing of this particular topic, a look back to remember what actually happened during the Cold War, how we tend to misremember things as the years pass, how we tend to make good and bad analogies of past history, and what's more helpful and less helpful to us in terms of lessons to be learned for the current context with Russia and China based on our past experiences with the Soviet Union. I reread the first chapter from this book this morning on strategy, in particular containment and how containment adapted over time. And was not sort of a single unifying concept that everyone can agree to. And it was just a masterfully done piece. And so I'm very much looking forward to this talk. And I think it's a wonderful talk for this particular audience here at the lab. Let me say a little bit about the speaker. Dr. Hal Brands is the Henry A. Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and he's a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. He served as Special Assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Strategic Planning from 2015 to 2016. He was a lead writer for the Commission on the National Defense Strategy for the United States, and he's consulted with a wide range of government offices and agencies in the intelligence and national security communities. Just a little bit on ground rules. Dr. Brands will deliver his remarks for about 30 to 45 minutes, at which point we'll open the floor for discussion. Please raise your hand electronically, and we'll call on you and unmute you. Please submit your questions otherwise in the chat function. Try to do this as Dr. Brands is speaking so we can get the discussion rolling quickly when he concludes, and we'll have a lot of fruitful commentary from you to engage with him in the question and answer period. So Hal, thank you again for taking the time to be with us today, and over to you for your remarks. Sorry, you're muted, Hal.
Works better this way, I guess. I was just saying thank you, Mike. I appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone today. So thank you for sharing a little bit of your time with me relatively early in the morning out there. And so, I'm going to try to get right into it, and I'm also going to try to kind of limit my prepared remarks to say 30, 35 minutes, because I think the most interesting part of this for me, and hopefully for you as well, will be kind of the back and forth and the discussion and question and answer. And I'm happy to take questions on any aspect of this, or contemporary U.S. Russia or U.S. China relations, because I think that's really where a lot of the interest in the subject comes from. I've always tried to think about history in an applied sense as opposed to a pure sense. I've always been interested in it for what the past can teach us about the present, rather than sort of studying the past for its own sake, even though that's a very important endeavor in its own right. And so I'm happy to take the discussion in pretty much any direction that people want to take it in. And maybe I'll start by explaining the significance of the book's title, which may be obvious to some people, it may not be obvious to others. And so, of course, the idea of the Twilight Struggle, or the idea of geopolitical competition as a Twilight Struggle, was really popularized by John Kennedy in a speech that he gave in 1961, in which he described the Cold War as a long twilight struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the meaning of the metaphor was basically this: twilight obviously is in between. It's neither day nor night. It's neither light nor dark. And Kennedy was saying that the Cold War was essentially the same thing. It was neither peace nor war. It obviously wasn't war of the sort that the United States had fought during World War II, a global hot military conflict, although there were certainly hot wars that were part of the Cold War. In some cases, the United States was directly involved in those hot wars in places like Korea and Vietnam. In other cases, they were proxy wars in places like Afghanistan or Nicaragua. But there was, of course, a significant amount of violence associated with the Cold War. What there was not, of course, was the global military confrontation on the order of World War I or World War II. So the Cold War wasn't war in that sense, but it wasn't really anything that Americans previously would have recognized as peace either. And so, in the context of the Cold War, the United States had to do a bunch of new stuff that it had never done before. It had never had a significant standing military establishment in peacetime prior to the Cold War. It had never built anything like the post war national security state that would take shape during the Cold War. It had never had a global network of alliance commitments. It had never taken peacetime responsibility for patrolling vulnerable frontiers half a world away. The United States had never really endured ongoing heightened political and military tensions over a sustained period of time in the way it did, particularly during the first half of the Cold War. And so it wasn't war, but it certainly wasn't peace as Americans had understood it either. It was sort of this in between state. And that was what Kennedy was referring to. And the reason that I appropriate that metaphor for the title of this book is I think you can make a pretty good argument that we're back in similar places today. We're really looking at two parallel or perhaps converging twilight struggles with China and Russia simultaneously. And so, if you think about what China is trying to accomplish in the world, I sometimes argue that China has essentially a fourfold approach to global affairs. The first is doing things that cement the CCP's rule in China. That's the foremost objective of every authoritarian regime. The second might be what I call making China whole again, reclaiming those pieces of the country that Chinese officials were wrenched away from China when it was weak and divided, Hong Kong, Taiwan, so on and so forth. The third might be carving out a sphere of influence in East Asia, in which China is the dominant power because the United States has been booted to the margins. And the fourth, which I think was a subject of debate for a long time, but the Xi Jinping and his advisors are becoming less and less abashed about proclaiming this every day, is making China the number one power in the world, attaining a degree of global influence and perhaps global primacy. And I think that Chinese leaders understand very well, perhaps better than American leaders understood for a number of years, that many of these objectives imply a degree of competition, perhaps even confrontation with the United States, because it is the United States that is seen to stand in the way of the achievement of these objectives. Of course, it's the United States that sells weapons to Taiwan and otherwise helps prevent the CCP from imposing its will on the government in Taipei. It's American alliances with Japan and Australia and the Philippines that stand in the way of Chinese ambitions in East Asia and so on and so forth. And so we're certainly seeing a heightened degree of competition with China over the past several years, which is likely to endure. We're seeing something similar with Russia, of course. And so what Russia is engaged in right now is an effort to reestablish a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, perhaps not reassembling the Soviet Union in a literal sense, but regaining much of the influence that Russia had in that region at the time when it was the head of the Soviet Union, and thereby rolling back the post Cold War settlement in Europe. And if you look at the draft treaties that the Russian Foreign Ministry put forward in December as the crisis with Ukraine was sharpening, they imply a vision of the future in which NATO's role in Europe is dramatically circumscribed, where the alliance is basically rolled back to where it stood in 1997 or so, and the US Europe tie is significantly loosened. And of course, that implies heightened frictions with the United States as well. So, in both cases, you have great power rivals who are pursuing projects that conflict with important US interests in significant ways, even though we can argue about how important those American interests are and what we should do to defend them. And in both cases, we're getting back kind of into a twilight situation where so far, most of these competitions have played out below the threshold of war. When we think about the expansion of Chinese influence, we often think about what China has done in the South China Sea, where it's basically used creative tactics below the use of force, creating artificial islands, for instance, to expand its influence in that critical area. When we think about Russian influence, we often think about political meddling and cyber warfare and things that fall outside of a traditional definition of war, as many of us understand it, although, of course, we're getting a different view of things in Ukraine right now. But this brings me to the second point, which is that both of these rivalries are playing out increasingly in the shadow of war. We've seen major Russian and Chinese military buildups over the last couple of decades meant to shift the balance of power in key regions. That's something I'll talk about more in a moment. We've seen Russia use force several times to reorder the landscape around it in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Kazakhstan, in Ukraine again, in ways that could, and I think we're seeing this in real time right now, there's a non-trivial danger of escalation with the West. And of course, the danger of China using force vis-a-vis Taiwan has been something that American military and civilian officials have been warning about increasingly loudly over the past couple of years. And in fact, I would make the argument, and this will reflect my own American perspective on this, but neither Xi Jinping nor Vladimir Putin is talking as though they view peace as the natural state of human affairs. And so, Putin's actions are obvious in recent weeks. But if you look at Xi Jinping, I mean, a lot of his rhetoric has become increasingly martial and increasingly confrontational. There was the comment back in July that anybody who stands in China's way will have their head bashed bloody by a great wall of steel. You've seen Chinese government outlets take similar stances. There was a moment over the summer when a Chinese propaganda outlet basically said if Japan does anything to get in the way of China's reunification with Taiwan, Japan would be the subject of multiple nuclear strikes by China. And so you can see that tensions are rising in important ways. And so obviously there's not a whole lot of good news in the talk that I've given to date. And of course there's a lot of bad news in the sense that we're going to be dealing with long protracted rivalries with a non-trivial danger of war. The good news, of course, is that we've done this before, and that great power competition is not as foreign or as abnormal as we've may seen. In fact, the argument that I start the book with is that great power competition is normal, that contests between the most powerful states in the international system for influence, for supremacy, to shape the way the international environment looks, those contests go back as far as recorded history. You can look at Athens and Sparta in the 5th century BC. You can look at Napoleon and his rivals in the early 19th century. You can look at the Anglo-Russian Great Game of the late 19th century, or you can look at the Cold War, the U.S.-Soviet rivalry during the 20th century. Some of these contests went hot, some of them stayed cold. There's no natural law that determines whether conflict breaks out. They were all different, and all of them have something to teach us about great power rivalry today. And I would argue that is especially the case with the U.S.-Soviet conflict. Now, the objection that I often get in dealing and making this point or in giving this talk is a fair one, which is that the US-Soviet Cold War was different in very important ways from the US-China relationship today or the US-Russia relationship. And I think that's true. And I'll just stipulate to a variety of ways in which these things are not the same. The geography of maritime Asia, where most of the US-China rivalry is playing out, is different, of course, than the geography of Central Europe. The geography of Eastern Europe is different than the geography of Central Europe. So the geography is not the same. The players are not the same. Xi Jinping is not Mao. He's not Stalin, even though he's taking on tendencies that are somewhat reminiscent of both increasingly of late. Vladimir Putin is not Stalin either, although you could make the same point about him. The setting is different. Now we worry about Russia and China upsetting a world order that is under considerable strain. In the late 1940s, there was no world order. One of the reasons we were so worried about the Soviet Union is that much of the world was still in chaos after World War II, and that created a lot of openings for Soviet influence. There are dimensions of the China challenge in particular that are arguably more challenging than anything that we faced during the Cold War, whether you're looking at simply the size of China's economy or the degree of economic and technical interlinkages with the United States and its allies. And so I don't want you to think that the argument I'm making is that one thing is the same as the next, and thus we can just rerun the Cold War playbook and be successful today. That's definitely not the argument that I'm making. But nonetheless, I think there are at least three good reasons why we can learn something useful from the Cold War and thinking about our current predicament. And the first one just comes back to what I mentioned before, which is that the Cold War was not entirely unique. There were aspects of it that were unique. It was the first long-term nuclear rivalry between great powers, but it was simply one manifestation of this longer running phenomenon of competition between the great powers. I think if Thucydides had been reawakened in the 1950s or the 1960s, he would have understood quite well what was going on. And so the Cold War, which was the most recent and in some ways one of the most epic incarnations of great power rivalry, can teach us something about that phenomenon and what it takes to succeed in it. The second reason is that there's not an inexhaustible list of examples of great power rivalry in America's own history. There's the Cold War, and there's maybe the Anglo-American competition in the late 19th century, but that's about it. There haven't been a lot of times when the United States has geared up over a period of decades for an ongoing rivalry with an authoritarian power in the space between war and peace. And so we're naturally going to look to this example in our own history for lessons, in part because it occurred within the living memory of a lot of American policymakers. And so my argument would be, let's do it systematically. Let's not do it superficially. Let's really get into the history and see what it tells us, because the alternative to using history well is typically using history poorly. And then the third argument I would make is that the Cold War is not a perfect analog for what the United States faces today, but it's not a terrible one either. The US Russia and US China competitions are struggles over the contours of world order. They have geopolitical and ideological dimensions, although that's a contested assertion, I recognize. But I would argue that there is a pronounced ideological aspect to the US China relationship in particular, and I'm happy to talk more about that. And being successful in these competitions is going to require doing a lot of things that we had to do during the Cold War. Shaping a strategy that can endure over a long period of time and be resilient to shocks and surprises. Managing an unwieldy coalition of allies and partners, figuring out how to blend competition and negotiation, and so on and so forth. All these things were part and parcel of American strategy during the Cold War. All of them will be very important today. And in fact, I would argue that the whole point of trying to learn from history uh, is that we believe we can learn something useful from a past that never looks exactly like the present, right? Even though what happened yesterday is never exactly like what's going to happen tomorrow, the reason we study history is we think it can somehow make the problems we face more familiar, more intellectually tractable. And in fact, Cold War policymakers, I think, understood this quite well. And so in 1947, George Marshall went to Princeton University in February and gave a speech basically on the qualities of leadership to the young men, and of course they were all young men at that point, who were studying there. And he basically argued, and I'm paraphrasing here, that no one could understand the Cold War without having a decent grasp of the rivalry between Athens and Sparta 2,500 years earlier. Uh, a month later, when Dean Acheson was trying to convince some skeptical senators and Congress and representatives that they should support emergency aid to Greece and Turkey in the context of the emerging Truman Doctrine, he used the example of Rome and Carthage to try to dramatize the stakes of the issue. And so you see this sort of reference to historical examples, historical reference points during the Cold War. And I think we're going to need to do the same thing to be effective today. And so that's all prologue, I think, to the substance of the book. And so maybe what I'll do in the remaining 15 minutes or so is just highlight a few key lessons from the book that I think might be useful in teeing up a discussion with you folks. And so the first one I would say is that the Cold War really highlights the importance of having a coherent theory of victory, a coherent theory of success, a sense of what we are trying to achieve over the long term and how we're going to do it. And I think this is an area where there's actually a significant contrast between the Cold War and today. And this is a probably a good point in the talk to mention George Kennan. And so Kennan obviously was America's foremost Soviet hand in the late 1940s. He spent about 20 years studying and living in that country. He was also one of America's first post-war grand strategists. He was sent to run the policy planning staff at the State Department in 1947 to help George Marshall make sense of some of the big first-order questions of strategy that the United States confronted. And he wrote a couple of very famous papers, the Long Telegram from Moscow in 1946, and then the X article published in Foreign Affairs in 1947. And what's interesting, if you go back and you read those papers, you can still profitably read them today, but they contain virtually nothing in the way of concrete policy prescriptions. You won't find Kennan's view of what's happening in Iran or what's happening in Greece or what's happening in any other places. What you will find is a very sharp diagnosis of the problem that the United States confronted with the Soviet Union, and then a theory of how the United States could get what it wants. And so basically it went like this. Kennan argued that the Soviet Union could never reconcile itself to the sort of world order that the United States was seeking to promote after World War II, because the combination of traditional Russian insecurity and expansion, communist ideology, and Stalin's own personal paranoia meant that the Soviet leadership believed that it was locked in deadly struggle with the capitalist world and could only attain its own security by essentially fundamentally disrupting the capitalist world. And so the Soviet Union was going to be a determined adversary, regardless of what the United States did, but it would also be a patient adversary because communist ideology taught Stalin and others that time was on the communist world side, and Stalin understood the Soviet Union was weaker than the United States. And so he wouldn't risk premature confrontation. He wasn't like Hitler or Napoleon, who had a fixed timetable for overturning the existing system. And so if the United States practiced this policy of containment, it was really just more of an idea when Kennan practiced it. If it found ways of holding the line against Soviet expansion, then it would disprove the Soviet theory of history, the Soviet view that communism was destined to triumph. It would increase the strains on the Soviet regime, and it would buy time for the weaknesses of that regime to come to the surface and ultimately result in what Kennan called the breakup or gradual mellowing of Soviet power. And of course, that's more or less what happened, although it took 45 years rather than the 15 that Kennan thought it might take. And so there was a really tight definition of the problem and an elegant theory of how the United States could pursue a particular policy that would get us to a better end state over time. I think we haven't quite gotten there in the current context. And so the last two US presidential administrations have talked about containment, or sorry, talked about competition with China. But of course, competition is really more of just a description of geopolitical reality than it is a strategy. And you've yet to get a really sharp answer of the question of what is it that the United States seeks vis-a-vis China, and how do we think that a more competitive policy gets us there? Do we think that if we compete more effectively over a period of a few years, it will lead to a change of heart in Beijing and we'll be able to get to a place where the US and China may still be rivals, but they respect each other's vital interests and there's not much danger of war? Do we think that this competition is going to last as long as the Chinese Communist Party lasts, in sort of the same way that pertained during the Cold War? You know, what is it that we think will ultimately lead us to a better place? That question hasn't yet been answered. And I think there are good reasons for that. I think there are still ongoing debates about the nature of the challenge that China faces. I think there's some diplomatic sensitivities around it as well. But I do think that ultimately we're going to need a better, sharper answer of the question, where are we going and how do we think we're going to get there? Because you do want to answer that question before you set off on a geopolitical journey of the sort that we're embarking on today. And so that would be a first lesson of the Cold War. A second lesson, which may seem obvious, but I think is worth hitting fairly hard today, is that the balance of military power shapes risk taking and decision making. And so uh, during the Cold War, there were big, long running debates over whether the military balance mattered and whether the nuclear balance mattered in particular. And there were one of our great political scientists, Robert Jervis, who just sadly passed away a few weeks ago, famously wrote an article in, I think it was 1979, the title of which was Why Nuclear Superiority Doesn't Matter. The argument basically being that it didn't matter who could make the rubble bounce higher at a certain point, that war between the great powers had become such an absurdity that it was not an option that any sane policymaker could contemplate, and thus the military balance didn't really matter. But I think what we've learned from looking back through the archival record on this period is that with respect to Professor Jervis, he was wrong. That understandings of the military balance conditioned our willingness and the Soviets' willingness to take risks, to run risks in pursuit of our objectives, even if we always wanted to avoid war because we knew how catastrophic it would be. And I can give you a couple of examples of this. And so during the late 1940s, the fact that the United States had a nuclear monopoly was very important in giving the Truman administration the sense of confidence that it needed to do things, the Marshall Plan, the creation of NATO, the creation of a West German state, that were destined to antagonize the Soviets, because we realized that that military advantage gave us an insurance policy, and thus it gave us a degree of political leeway that we wouldn't otherwise have enjoyed. You could make the same argument about later stages of the Cold War. One reason that the Soviet Union becomes more globally assertive in the 1970s and intervenes in places like Angola, for instance, is because the balance of military power has shifted in Moscow's direction over the intervening 30 years. And then I think if you look at the last decade of the Cold War, you can see this perhaps most dramatically, where it is the Soviet realization that the Moscow is falling hopelessly behind in the military balance as a result of U.S. improvements in both conventional and nuclear forces, that really starts to push the leadership in the Kremlin to think about ways that it can de-escalate the confrontation, even at the expense of parting with some of the objectives that it had pursued up to that point. And so it wasn't that policymakers in Washington or in Moscow ever really wanted war, but they knew that it was important that both sides were going to look down the decision tree in a crisis, think about how a particular outcome might occur if war did break out, and that would condition their political behavior as well. So the military balance did shape risk taking and decision making. And again, I think this is a parallel that we need to be able to learn from today. And so part of the problem is that the United States faces and has been facing over a number of years severely eroding balances of conventional military power in two theaters at once, in the Western Pacific and also in Eastern Europe. And as that happens, the willingness of Russia and China to use force or to use coercion in support of their interests, I would argue, has become greater and will continue to become greater. And the United States also has an even bigger problem, which the Ukraine war has revealed, which is that we are increasingly a global superpower with a one war military. And we have made that shift in our defense strategy for some good reasons, not least of which is the fact that it's going to take sustained focus on the China problem in particular to ensure that the United States can win even one war against an adversary, should that, God forbid, occur. But it's also leaving us exposed in other theaters. I think there are things that we can do to solve this problem. I think there are some relatively straightforward steps the United States could take in Eastern Europe and the Western Pacific to at least shore up the military balance a little bit. I'm hopeful that the Ukraine crisis will produce some of these investments and will provoke a broader rethink of U.S. defense strategy. But I think the lesson of the Cold War is if we don't do this, we will pay for it politically or otherwise eventually. Okay, this brings me to a third lesson, which is that it's really important to think about negotiation as a tool of competition, not as a replacement for it. And so it's not true that diplomacy or arms control is kind of silly peacenik stuff. It played a really important role in the U.S. competitive toolkit during the Cold War. Every U.S. president met with his Soviet counterpart at the summit at least once during the Cold War. There were a variety of U.S.-Soviet agreements that were reached on arms control and other issues. There was typically some sort of U.S.-Soviet diplomatic process ongoing during the Cold War, with some important exceptions. And I think what the reason for this is that American policymakers typically understood that there were a handful of really important strategic objectives that could be furthered or even attained through the pursuit of diplomacy with an adversary. And so one of these objectives, perhaps the most obvious, was simply reducing the risk of war at the margin. And so I think American policymakers mostly understood that the danger of war was rooted in political disagreements between the US and the Soviet Union, but there were things that we could do that would reduce the risk of an unwanted conflict. And so one of the most interesting agreements of the Cold War is actually a tacit agreement. It was never set down in writing, that the United States and the Soviet Union would not shoot down each other's reconnaissance satellites, because we both understood that it was actually dangerous for the other side not to have any clue what you were doing with your own military preparations, your military posture, because that might get them into worst case thinking and lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy, that what Thomas Schelling called the reciprocal fear of surprise attack could be very damaging. And so that was one purpose for diplomacy. A second one would be to isolate areas of cooperation, even within a competitive context. And so, although it's sometimes forgotten now, though probably not by this crowd, the United States and the Soviet Union in the middle of the Cold War signed one of the most transformative international agreements of all time, which was the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty in 1968. And it was rooted in a recognition that the United States and the Soviet Union, whatever their geopolitical and ideological differences, had a common interest in preventing the nuclear anarchy that could occur if you had 20, 30, 40 nuclear states by the 1970s, which was thought feasible at the time. The US and the Soviet Union cooperated on a really innovative program to eradicate smallpox during the late 1970s, late 1960s and 1970s, something that has sort of interesting salience today. And so that was a second area in which diplomacy could be useful. And a third area would be using diplomacy as a way of steering the competition into areas of American advantage, or simply giving us a strategic breather when we needed it. And so one of the purposes of détente, as Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon pursued it in the late 60s and early 70s, was just to give the United States a break, give it a pause after it had exhausted itself during the Cold War. And one of the effects of pursuing the arms control agreements of that era, so the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in particular, there was a competitive rationale here. And so the ABM Treaty pressed pause on a particular aspect of the arms race at a time when the United States was in no position to compete there, because there just wasn't any congressional willingness to fund sustained investments in missile defenses during the 1970s. We rethought that position during the 1980s when things changed. In the same way, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty basically caps the quantitative arms race by saying you can only have X number of SLBMs or ICBMs. But in doing so, it places a higher premium on the quality and on the technological sophistication of your nuclear forces, which is a contest that played to America's advantage in the end, and that was becoming increasingly clear by the 1980s. Diplomacy can even be useful as a way of keeping your allies and your own population on side by making the point that we have at least tried to exhaust the alternatives to a dangerous rivalry. And so it played a really important role. We need to be thinking about this in a similar way today. We shouldn't assume that US diplomacy with Russia or China can transcend competitions that are rooted in very deep clashes of interests. I don't think we should make concessions on geopolitical issues to get China's cooperation on climate change, for instance, and I'm happy to say more about that. But I do think that we should try to patiently explore potential areas of cooperation. We should think about areas where unrestrained competition may not actually benefit us. Perhaps an example of that would be the intersection of new technologies with strategic nuclear systems and things like that. And we should view diplomacy as a way of inserting pauses in the competition when we need them, and otherwise making the competition safe and tolerable enough for us so that we are willing to see it through to a successful conclusion. And so that's a third lesson I would flag. Let me just hit two or three more, and then I'll wrap up. A fourth lesson I think would be that you win bilaterally in a competition like this by competing multilaterally, or that the best outside game is actually a good inside game. And so the most effective thing that the United States did uh, during the Cold War wasn't something it did to the Soviet Union. It was something that it did with its friends, which was basically constructing the basis of the international order that we enjoy today. It was concluding alliances like NATO with the Europeans. It was laying the basis for a prosperous and thriving free world. It was rehabilitating former enemies like Japan and West Germany, and thereby creating an international system that was robust against Soviet influence, because the Soviet Union could not overcome or outcompete or outperform the countries that were arrayed against it. This was a world historical achievement. It meant that the world after 1945 looked nothing like the world between, say, 1900 and 1945, which had seen repeated crack-ups within the capitalist world. And it was one of the most effective things the United States did in competition vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. It wasn't easy, and there were lots of tensions between the United States and its allies. And so the lesson I'm drawing here is not that the United States should always be nice to its allies. U.S. ally relations during the Cold War could be pretty bare-knuckled affairs. We now know, for instance, that if the Soviets had successfully overrun Western Europe, we were prepared to nuke our own allies rather than see their industrial capacity harnessed by the Soviet Union. The Allies could be pretty cold in their own right. And so, of course, Charles de Gaulle withdraws France from NATO's integrated military command in 1966 because he knows that he can do so without penalty. The United States simply must defend France in the process of defending Germany. And this leads to one of the most memorable conversations in U.S. alliance management during the Cold War, where de Gaulle says to Dean Rusk, the American Secretary of State, every American soldier must leave France. It is a matter of national dignity for France. And Rusk stares hard at him and says, does that include the Americans who are buried in the military cemeteries in Normandy? And so it's just a reminder that there was a lot of friction in U.S. ally relations during the Cold War. And it will be the same today. But nonetheless, America's alliances, they are our asymmetric advantage. They are our secret sauce in the competition with Russia and China. They provide a degree of geopolitical overmatch that the other side cannot overcome so long as these alliances hold together. And so it can seem daunting to have to compete with Russia and China simultaneously until you figure in the fact that if you add up the US plus its allies in Europe plus its allies in the Indo-Pacific, that coalition outweighs Russia and China together significantly in economic terms and military terms and basically any index of national power. And so there will be difficult conversations involved in keeping American allies on board. There will be difficulties involved in moving these coalitions with the degree of urgency that is necessary to get them ready for some of the trials they may face. But that will once again be the most critical thing the United States has to do. A fifth lesson is that it's difficult to win a Cold War or to win a Twilight Struggle purely on the defensive. We sometimes think that containment was a doctrine that just involved sort of sitting patiently and waiting for the Soviet Union to implode. That's not true, of course. I mean, the United States and its allies did lots of things to try to increase the strains on the Soviet bloc and the Soviet system itself. Some of them were fairly effective. Information operations run by Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe, I think, were quite effective, but they took a long time to work. Some of them were totally ineffective. The United States ran various covert programs in Eastern Europe and even within the Soviet Union in the late 1940s and early 1950s that mostly succeeded in getting a lot of brave people killed. Some of them were very, very effective. And so the U.S. Undertaking to make the war in Afghanistan as costly as possible for the Soviet Union in the 1980s helped push the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan and intensify the strains of the Soviet system itself. And all of these were rooted in a sense that you had to take a forward-leaning approach to imposing costs on the other side in long competition, because in a long competition, how effectively you are able to use your resources is going to be a determinant of success. And so we often tried to complement a broad defense with a selective offense because we understood that the Soviets were, of course, trying to do the same thing to us. We weren't trying to overthrow the regime in the Soviet Union in the same way that I don't think we should try to do that vis-a-vis Russia or China today. We were trying to make life harder, and we were trying to divert Soviet resources to less threatening purposes. I think, again, there's a useful parallel here today. The United States is going to have to find ways of throwing Russia and China on the defensive from time to time, if only because they're working very hard to do that to us. Now, this falls in the category of easy to say, hard to do, but I think there are at least 3 examples of places where there are meaningful cost imposition opportunities for the United States. One would be in more aggressively publicizing the corruption of the Chinese and the Russian regimes. This is clearly a sore point in their dealings with their own people. And so it's an area where the United States could probably pursue some relatively effective information operations. A second area might be undermining or at least complicating efforts to construct elaborate systems of digital political control in places like China. There's been some very interesting writing done on the way that you can effectively spoof AI and big data enabled social control systems by feeding adversarial inputs into the system, and making the system think that the dissident is a cat, or vice versa. And I think there are opportunities for that as well. And then the last area would be simply doing things like sanctioning Chinese officials who are involved in massive human rights violations or in the suffocation of Hong Kong's political system. And this is useful because it allows the United States to speak out on behalf of values that it stands for, but also in the sense that it can be a way of sort of pursuing bait and bleed strategies vis-a-vis China. And so I'll give you an example of this. In early 2021, the US and a coalition of a few dozen other democracies, mostly European countries and then Anglosphere countries, got together and slapped some fairly symbolic sanctions on Chinese officials involved in the repression in Xinjiang. And the Chinese kind of freaked out over it. And so they responded by lashing out, sanctioning a bunch of European officials, even European think tanks. And in doing so, they so overreacted that the European Union was forced to put on hold the comprehensive agreement on investment that the EU and Beijing had signed just a few months earlier. So it's an example of sort of a counterproductive, self-defeating Chinese response that was provoked by a little bit of cost imposition behavior by the United States. That, of course, is a recipe for heightened tensions, but it may also be a prerequisite of competitive success. And this brings me to the final point I'll make. And this is just to reiterate the point that, while a Cold War with Russia or a Twilight Struggle with China may not sound like a whole lot of fun, the history of the original Cold War reminds us that there are worse things than having to wage such a contest. It's a mistake to think that containment was a strategy that enjoyed universal support and appeal at the time. It was critiqued from the left and from the right. It was hammered for being plotting and indecisive, for combining, it seemed like, perpetual danger with perpetual indecision, for forcing the United States to make all sorts of commitments that Americans had never made in the past. And so if you go back just to the late 1940s, it's remarkable. Containment is critiqued by conservatives like Robert Taft, Mr. Republican, the old isolationist who argued against creating the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949. It was also attacked by people on the left, and not just on the Henry Wallace left, but on the mainstream Walter Lippmann left. Walter Lippmann really did more than anybody else to popularize the term the Cold War in the United States, and he did it in a book that was actually harshly critical of containment and said this thing will never work. The effort to contain Soviet influence globally will lead us to make terrible mistakes. It will lead us to throw in our prestige and resources with dubious regimes in the third world, in places where the moral merits of these questions are quite ambiguous. And you know what? Lippmann wasn't entirely wrong about that. And certainly in the late 1960s, as Vietnam had gone very bad for the United States, he looked quite prescient. But of course, Americans stuck with containment over a 40-year period, not because they thought it was a brilliant strategy, but because they thought it was the best of the bad alternatives. It was an alternative to the diplomatic appeasement that had helped to bring on World War II. It was also an alternative to the global war that would have resulted in World War III and a nuclear age. Containment really represented a narrow and difficult path between two repugnant alternatives. And that was what made it an effective strategy over time. Today, I think it's entirely understandable why people are uncomfortable often with the Cold War analogy for China or Russia, because it reminds them of how awful the initial Cold War was. There was nothing that we should, particularly long for in getting back to a Cold War. But I do think it also reminds us that there are worse things to the sort of worse things than the sort of competitions that the United States is going to have to contest today. I think to put this in perhaps put it in moral terms, Putin's war in Ukraine is reminding us that there is radical evil in the world. It is reminding us that the alternative to deterring war may be fighting it. And I think it's also reminding us that the alternative to successfully competing with Russia and China is probably to see these countries consign the world order that the United States helped create during the post-war system and which expanded after the end of the Cold War to history. And that would lead to a pretty dark future. And so waging Twilight Struggles is not going to be a particularly pretty or attractive scenario, but I think it's a way of avoiding a future that could be uglier still. So why don't I stop there? I think I've gone on for about 40 minutes, and I look forward to any questions, challenges, discussion that may emerge as a result of this.